am your host, G.I. Wingnut. Welcome back to my channel. We are continuing with Atlantis and Lemuria, written by Rudolph Steiner and originally published in 1911. Let's get right on into it. Chapter 7, The Beginnings of Sexual Duality. A description of the constitution of man before the division into male and female sexes must now be given. The body consisted then of a soft plastic mass. Over it, the willpower was far more potent than was the case with mankind subsequently. On this separation from the parent being, man appeared, it is true, as an organism with members, but incomplete. His organs continued their further development apart from the parent body. Is he describing evolution from some sort of primordial source? Asking for a friend. All right, back to the story. Much of that which at a later period ripened within the maternal organism was then brought to perfection by an external force akin to our willpower. An external force. The Pleiadians, maybe? Or one of those energy being aliens that are often talked about within the conspiracy theory community. Just asking questions. Moving on. The parents' fostering care was necessary to promote such a ripening from without. Man brought with him into the world certain organs which he afterwards discarded. Others, still quite imperfect at his first appearance, completed their development. The whole process permits of a comparison with liberation from an egg form and the casting off of the outer covering. But we must here not think of a hard and egg-like shell. Oh boy. Man's body was warm-blooded. This must be distinctly stated, for in former times it was otherwise, as will afterwards be shown. The process of maturing apart from the mother entity was accomplished under the influence of increased warmth conveyed in like manner from without. So basically an incubator. Okay, continuing with it. But by no means must we imagine a hatching out of the egg-shaped man, so named for the sake of brevity. The comparisons of warmth and fire on the earth were different then from those of later times. By means of his own force, a man could constrain and confine within a certain space fire or warmth. In short, he could concentrate heat. This was thus in a position to supply warmth to the young creature that required it for his development. Okay, manifested incubators. Gotcha. Continuing. The organs of motion were at that time man's most highly developed organs. The sense organs of today were then quite unevolved. The most advanced were the organ of hearing and the organs of the perception of cold and heat, the sense of feeling. Still far beyond was the perception of light. Man was born with the senses of hearing and touch, and then somewhat later the light perception was evolved. Well, this sounds like some of those evolutionary eugenics supporting talking points I've heard before. Interesting. Back to the story. All that is stated here refers to the latest period before the separation of the sexes. The latter proceeded slowly and gradually. For a long time before its actual appearance, mankind began to develop in such a way that one individual was born with more of the masculine, the other more of the feminine character. Nevertheless, the characteristics of the opposite sex were present in every individual, so that spontaneous generation was possible, though not at all times, for it was dependent upon the influences of external conditions at certain seasons of the year. Oh, so spontaneous generation, so you could copulate with yourself and produce offspring. Asexual, I think, is the scientific term for it. Interesting. And I remember back in college, I did a paper on a book on psychology in the late 1800s, which promoted the notion that all creatures, plant and animal, all creations, plants and animals, are inherently bisexual. So now I'm understanding that a bit better because of this. And don't forget, Rudolph Steiner is founder of the Anthroposophical Society, an offshoot basically of the Theosophical Society. All right, so let's get back to this story. For that reason, he had to regulate in all undertakings in accordance with such outer conditions, in accordance, for example, with the course of sun and moon. This regulation did not, however, take place consciously in the present sense of the term, but was carried out in a manner which must rather be called instinctive, a term indicating the mental life of the man of that time. So basically just animalistic instincts. Gotcha. Back to the story. This mental life cannot be described as an actual inner life. Bodily and mental activities and qualities were not as yet rigidly separated from one another. The outer life of nature was still experienced by the soul. Oh, okay, hang on. Continue. It was above all on the sense of hearing that every single vibration from without made a powerful impression. Okay, so I've been doing some studying on Agrippa, and this whole thing about the separation of the sexes from the source life and trying to get back to that point was part of the philosophy that Agrippa had apparently developed. But also this every single vibration from without made a powerful impression reminds me of some of the things I've been hearing in the conspiracy theory community about Nikola Tesla and him saying, if you want to understand the universe, think in terms of frequency, vibration, and energy. So, let's get back to this story. Every quiver in the air, every movement in his surroundings were heard. Quote unquote, heard. The wind and the water expressed in their motions what a man was was an eloquent language. It was a perception of the mysterious weaving and working in nature which thus penetrated man, and this weaving and working resounded again in his soul. His activity was an echo of these influences. He transformed the perception of sound in his own activity. He lived amid those surgings of sound and brought them into the expression by means of his own will. In like manner, he was impelled to accomplish all his daily work. Man, there's a bunch of Kabbalah in there. There's a bunch of quantum physics in there. Quantum healing is all tangled up in there because of the quantum physics and the Kabbalistic teachings. Oh my goodness. Um, wow. Okay. Anyway, moving on. By these he knew where to settle or recognize the dangers threatening his life and so avoided them. He regulated the taking of sustenance accordingly. Altogether, pardon me, altogether different from that of later times was the course taken by the rest of his mental life. Pictures lived in his soul, not as representations of external things. That's just another way of using a Scientology term, as I've mentioned, um, facsimiles, or just group memory. This goes directly back to that whole Akashic record and the psychic connection with it, with a unified universal knowledge database. So back to the story. When, for example, man moved from a colder to warmer place, there arose in his soul a different color picture. But this color picture had nothing to do with any external object. I do not understand how that works. Okay. Continuing. It sprang from an inner force akin to the will. Wait, what? Pictures like these continually filled the soul. Downloads. Okay. Okay, I'm starting to see what you're trying to say. I think, maybe. Uh, the whole can only be compared while the rising and falling dream visions of man, or with the rising and falling dream visions of man. Only at that time the pictures were not unregulated, but in conformity with laws, and for that reason we must not speak at this stage of humanity of a dream consciousness, but rather of a picture consciousness. Oh, the Akashic Records, a library of pictures. Huh. Okay, so maybe that's why memes work so well. Interesting. Moving on. In the main, it was color pictures with which this consciousness was filled, but these were not the only kind. Thus, man wandered through the world, experiencing its events by means of his senses of hearing and feeling, but in his inner life this world was reflected in pictures, very unlike those existing in the outer world. Ah, so like sending out a robot to do ultrasonic mapping, not actual machine vision mapping like with cameras. Okay, back to this story. Pleasure and pain were bound up with these soul pictures in a much smaller degree than in the case with man's ideas today, which reflect his perception in the whole or in the world, in the world outside. Doubtless, one picture caused him pleasure, another disgust, the one hatred, the other love, but these sensations bore a much fainter character. On the other hand, strong feelings were produced by something else. Man was then much more agile, much more active than later. Everything in his surroundings, as well as the pictures in his soul, stirred him to activity, to movement. Now, when his activity, unhindered by had free play, he experienced a sensation of well-being. When, however, this activity was checked in any direction, he was overcome by unhappiness and discomfort. Okay, so interacting with the environment, something like an octopus, just that may not be a great analogy, but they definitely respond to the vibrations in their environment. That's how they sense threats. as far as being activated and his activity unhindered, had free play, and expressed a sensation of well-being and a mesmerized euphoric state like in the yoga groups or maybe within the evangelical movement. When, however, this activity was checked in any direction when they run into something or fall to the ground, it was overcome with unhappiness and discomfort, or potentially the opposite, absolute bliss and total release, as is seen within the evangelical movement when slain in the spirit, or had a pagan gathering and being caught up in the rhythm of the drum circle and the euphoria of the group worship or prayer or incantations to the moon. Very similar experiences, and I speak from a personal perspective. Anyway, continuing with this crazy story, the absence or presence of opposition to his will determined the content of his life of feeling, his pleasure and his pain. And this pleasure or this pain discharged itself again in his own soul as a living world of pictures, clear, bright, beautiful pictures lived within him, when he was able to expand unhindered. Gloomy and misshapen gloomy and misshapen were those which appeared in his soul, which his movements were hampered. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense because if somebody has, okay, I can sum it up this way. A closed mind cannot learn. An open mind does not want to stop learning. So when you're hampered in that aspect, because of a lack of access to materials or new materials to further research, it does create unhappiness for me. Just saying. So, let's try to get this chapter wrapped up. I don't remember how much more we have on it. I just kind of scanned through it, didn't read anything. Anyway, back to it. So far, the average man has been described. In this case, in the case of those who had developed into a kind of superhuman state, the inner life was different. With them, the soul life was not of this instinctive character. What they perceived through their senses of hearing and feeling were nature's deeper secrets, and these they could consciously interpret. Okay, so they were conscious, but they didn't. Okay. In the roaring of the wind and the rustling of the trees, the laws and the wisdom of nature were disclosed. And in their soul pictures, these were not mere reflections of the outer world, but images of the spiritual powers in the world. Oh, wow. So, Great Reawakening Tour and spiritual warfare? Huh. Okay. Let's get back to it. It was not the things of sense which they perceived, but spiritual intelligences. The Ascended Masters, anyone? Moving on. If the average man, for example, experienced a sensation of fear, a hideous, sinister picture would arise in his soul. The superhuman being received by means of such picture information, revelation from the spiritual beings of the world, or certain alien species I've heard of. Continuing. The processes of nature did not appear to him as they do to the naturalist of today, dependent on lifeless natural laws, but rather as the deeds of spiritual beings. The outer reality did not as yet exist, for these were no outer senses, but to the higher beings, the inner reality revealed itself. Esotericism is the key, apparently. All right, moving on. The Spirit poured its rays into them as the sunlight streams into the physical eye of man, of today. The sevenfold rays, or the sevenfold rays. That's what I was thinking of. Third eye opening, yoga meditation. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of this playing out today, and this book was published in 1911. Just a friendly reminder. Moving on. There was no such thing as combining and speculating among them, but a direct contemplation of the working of spiritual beings. These superhuman individualities could thus absorb directly into their wills communications coming from the spiritual world, downloads. Consciously, they led the others. They received their mission from the spiritual world and acted in accordance with it. And an angel appeared in my bedroom. Jesus played his saxophone for me. Okay. Back to it. Now, when the time arrived at which the sexes separated, these beings naturally considered it their task to influence the new life in conformity with their mission. The regulation of sexual life originated with them. All arrangements which had to do with the generation of mankind had their source in them. In this, they acted with perfect consciousness. But the other human beings were sensible of the impulse only as an instinct implanted in them. The enlightened elite. Continuing. Sexual love was implanted in man by direct thought transference, lust, and all its expressions were at first of the noblest kind. Everything in this domain which was has taken on an ugly character dates from a later period, when man had become more independent and when he had sullied a desire originally pure. Okay. A personal observation I want to interject here. The best way to make the worst thing is to take a beautiful thing and corrupt it. The easiest way to corrupt something is get man involved. All right, so moving on. In these early times, there was no such thing as a satisfaction of sexual desire for its own sake. In other words, there was no lust. Purity culture notion, or maybe a Quaker notion of sex for reproduction only. Sounds kind of like some of those New Apostolic Reformation evangelicals as well. I digress. Back to it. Everything then was a service of sacrifice for the continuance of human existence, reproduction. Generation was regarded as a sacred thing, as a service which man owed to the world, and sacrificial priests were the leaders and rulers in this domain. Quiverful movements, anyone? Oh my goodness. Back to it. Of another kind were the influences of the semi-superhuman beings. The latter were not developed to the stage, the latter were not developed to the stage at which they could receive the revelations of the spiritual world in all their purity. In their soul picture, there arose, besides the impressions of the spiritual world, the activities also of the world of sense. Those were, in the fullest sense, superhuman. Let me try that again. Those who were in the fullest sense superhuman beings had no sensation of either pleasure or pain from the external world. They abandoned themselves entirely to the revelations of the spiritual powers. Wisdom flowed into them as light flows into the creatures of sense. Their will was directed towards nothing else but to the action in accordance with this wisdom, and in action of this kind lay their highest pleasure. Wisdom, will, and activity composed their very being. It was otherwise with the semi-superhuman beings. They felt the desire to receive impressions from without and connected pleasure with the satisfaction of this desire, disappointment with its lack. They were thus distinguished from the superhuman beings. For the latter, impressions from without were nothing more than the confirmation of spiritual revelations. Signs and wonders, anyone? They might behold the outer world and receive nothing more than a reflection of that which they had already received through the Spirit. The semi-superhuman beings experienced something new to them, and that account they were able to, and on that account, they were able to be the leaders of mankind. When the latter began to change the mere pictures in the soul into images, into representations of outer objects, manifestation, name it and claim it. Word of faith. It sounds like structures designed to create personas like the one that Robin Bullock puts out. Just thinking out loud. Okay, back to it. This happened when a part of the earlier human generative force turned inwards, and when beings possessing a brain were evolved. For with the brain, man also developed the capacity to change external sense impressions into mind conceptions. They became cognizant. Okay. It must be said, therefore, that man was impelled by superhuman beings to turn his soul towards the external world of sense. It was indeed denied him to expose his own soul pictures directly to pure spiritual influences. The ability to generate his kind was implanted in him as an instinctive impulse by the superhuman beings. Implanted, huh? So, yeah, L. Ron Hubbard talks about Thetans being implanted in bodies, or spirits being implanted. Anyway. Oh, boy. Moving on. He became a being self-conscious in the world of sense. And thus, man achieved the ability to guide his actions consciously and according to his perceptions in the world of sense. That reminds me of a Tesla quote about, or an alleged Tesla quote about the planet will one day become self-aware, will become sentient as a course of evolution through technology. So there's that. Back to it. Once he had acted from a kind of instinct under the sway of his external surroundings and energizing forces playing upon him from higher individualities. Now he began to follow the urgings, the allurings of his own conceptions, and with this the free will of mankind appeared in the world. That was the beginning of good and evil. So, this I will get to the Scientology aspects of that at another time. You'll be able to do the comparisons for yourself. I will try to remember to make the cross-reference. Back to this wacky story. Before advancing further in this direction, something must be said about man's environment on the earth. Side by side with man, there existed animals as well, which, according to their kind, were at the same stage of development as he was. Okay, so a little bit of Garden of Eden, and is that Kent Hovind that has the Ark experience? Anyway, back to it. In accordance with our present conceptions, they would be counted as reptiles. Oh, dinosaurs to birds. Gotcha. Moving on. Besides these, there were other lower forms of the animal world. Now, there was an essential difference between man and the animals. On account of his still plastic body, man could only live in those regions of the earth which had not yet reached the densest material form, and in these regions, animals possessing a plastic body lived with him. In other regions, however, animals lived which had already dense bodies and which had also already developed unisexuality and their sense organs. Whence they came will be shown later. They could develop no farther because their bodies had taken on the denser matter too soon. Some species among them have disappeared. Some have developed further after their kind into the present forms. Yes, this is trying to explain evolution. Moving on. Man was able to reach higher forms because he remained in those regions which had, at that time, suited his structure. On that account, his body remained so flexible and soft that he was able to single out of himself those organs which were capable of fructification by the mind. His external body had then advanced so far that it could densify and become a protecting sheath for the finer mental organs. In other words, he developed a skull and maybe a rib cage. Well, I guess you don't. Yeah, a skull and a rib cage. Okay, continuing. But all human bodies were not so far developed. Those that were so developed were few. These were first of all vivified by the mind. Others were not vivified. So this is how they I'm wondering how they're coming up with the superiority of one race over another because their early developments were different and that's why they look different, or I don't know. Back to this. Back to it. Had the mind entered the latter as well, it would only have been able partially to evolve because of the imperfect inner organs, and so these human personalities had for the time being to continue their development as a kind of mindless creature. A third kind had proceeded so far that feeble mental impulses could make themselves felt. These stood between the other two kinds. Their mental activity remained dull. They had to be led by higher mental powers. Between these three kinds were all possible grades of transition. Further development was now only possible if one part of mankind should educate itself more highly at the cost of another part. First of all, the absolutely mindless had to be sacrificed. That's eugenics, filtering out the unneeded, the quote unquote unneeded, the quote unquote unwanted, the those with mental development issues, autism, for example, or psychiatric issues, or developmental retardation, or however you want to put it. Wow. Eugenics on a full tilt boogie. Next, it goes on with an intermingling with them for the purpose of propagation would only have dragged the more advanced down to their level. Yes, this is Eugenics 101. Continuing. And so all who had received the mind principle were singled out from among the others. Therefore, they fell more and more to the level of animality. Thus, side by side with mankind, animals resembling man evolved themselves further. Wow, this is some painful revelation here. Man, continuing, man left, as it were, a portion of his brothers behind him on the path, so that he might develop so that he might himself mount higher. This process was, however, by no means at an end here. Those men, also of dull mentality, who stood rather higher, could only advance farther by being drawn into association with higher beings, by separating themselves from the less mentally gifted. Well, that was a friendly way of wording it. Uh, or should we call that a backhanded compliment? Lord have mercy. Bless their pea picking little hearts. All right. And then this is how we get the guru sensation, huh? All right. Moving on. Only by these means could they develop bodies afterwards suited for the reception of the entire human intelligence. Not until after the lapse of a certain time had physical evolution advanced so far that, in this direction, a sort of pause set in, during which all lying beyond a fixed limit belonged to the human domain. Oh, the human condition. Okay, gotcha. Continuing. The conditions of life on the earth had meantime so changed that a further rejection would have resulted in the production not of animal like beings, but of such as were not even fit to live. Physical deformities, maybe. Continuing. But what was thrust down into the state of animality had neither died out or lives on in various higher animals. In such, therefore, we must recognize creatures which had to remain behind at an earlier stage of the human development. Only they have not retained the same form which they had at that time of their separation, but have degenerated from a higher to a lower type. Thus, monkeys are retrograde human beings of the bygone age. Oh, so they're flipping the evolutionary script here. They're not saying that man came from monkeys. They're saying monkeys came from man. Oh, wow. Degraded humans. Holy cow. All right, let's finish this out. Thus, as man was at one time less perfect than he is today, so were these at one time more perfect than at present. And that which remained within the domain of man has undergone a like process within its own limits. In many a savage tribe, we may see the degraded descendants of human forms which were at one time more exalted. These have not sunk to the levels of the brute, but only to that of the savage. That which in man is eternal is the mind. It has been shown at what period of the mind entered the body. Let me try that again. That which is in man is eternal and is the mind. It has been shown at what period the mind entered the body. Before the time of the mind belonged to other regions. It could not unite itself with the body till the latter had attained a certain stage of development. Only when there is a perfect comprehension of the way in which this union took place can the meaning of birth and death be understood, or the character of the everlasting mind become known. Yes, getting back to the source. That's their thing. All right, so there we go. That was chapter 7. Monkeys are degraded humans. I had not heard that before. Interesting. Kudos to you if you made it this far into the video. If you have not yet and you liked this content, please subscribe to my channel, give me a thumbs up, and by all means, do not be afraid to share this information with anybody that you think might benefit from it. Until the next video, I hope you take good care of yourself. Genuine mental health matters. Scrutinize the resources that you utilize. Find out where those sources got their resources. So, until the next video, be safe, be kind, and just try to be a better human than you were yesterday. Everybody wants to